It was almost 11 at night when I heard it for the first time. 3 slow knocks, then nothing. I was sitting on the edge of my bed with the lights off, staring at my own front door like it might do something on its own, and all I could think was, they told me this would happen, and I still wasn't ready for it. I had been living in that small rented house for exactly 19 days. 19 days of quiet mornings, friendly neighbors, and one piece of advice that everyone in that town seemed to agree on without ever fully explaining it. Don't open your door after 10. I didn't understand what that meant the first time someone said it to me. By the time I finally understood, I looked at that whole town completely differently, and honestly, I looked at myself differently too. I should probably explain how I ended up there in the first place, because none of this makes much sense without the context of who I was before I arrived. I wasn't running from anything dramatic. There was no crisis behind the decision, no failed relationship, no burnout story you'd see in a movie. I'd spent most of my adult life in one city, working a job that paid the bills but never really asked much of me beyond showing up on time and doing what was expected. I had a routine so fixed I could have navigated most of my week with my eyes closed. Wake up, commute, work, commute home, dinner, sleep, repeat. It wasn't a bad life. It just wasn't a life that asked anything new of me, and somewhere in my early 30s I started noticing how much that bothered me. When the chance came to take a long-term assignment overseas, helping set up a small training program in a rural provincial town, I said yes almost before I finished reading the email. My family thought I was being impulsive. Maybe I was, but I wanted something that felt unfamiliar. I wanted mornings that didn't already know what they were going to look like before I even opened my eyes. I didn't think much past that feeling. I packed 2 suitcases, told my family I'd call every Sunday, and landed in a country I'd only ever seen in documentaries, and a handful of videos I'd watched late at night when I couldn't sleep. The town itself was smaller than I expected, even smaller than the photos had suggested. One main road ran through the center of it, lined with a market that opened before sunrise and closed by early afternoon, and houses spaced out with small gardens between them. Dogs wandered freely, seeming to belong to everyone and no one at the same time, trotting between yards like they were checking in on the whole neighborhood. My rented house sat at the edge of a quiet street, close enough to walk to the market in under 10 minutes, but far enough from the main road that at night it was almost completely silent. For the first 2 weeks, that silence felt like a gift. Back home, I had never once slept with my window cracked open, listening to nothing but insects and wind moving through the trees outside. Here it felt like the whole world had exhaled, and I was finally allowed to exhale along with it. The neighbors were kind in a way that genuinely surprised me, especially coming from a place where most people barely acknowledged you in an elevator. An older woman 2 houses down, whose name I later learned was Aling Fay, started leaving extra vegetables from her garden on my front step without ever mentioning it, like it was simply understood that this is what you do for someone new in the neighborhood. I'd open my door in the morning and find a small bundle wrapped in banana leaf sitting there, and I never once caught her doing it. A man who ran the little shop by the corner, whose name was Mang Ramil, learned my order after only the 2nd visit and had it ready before I even asked, calling out a greeting the moment he saw me coming down the road. People waved from their porches. People remembered my name faster than I remembered theirs, which embarrassed me more than once. It felt, for those first 2 weeks, like exactly the kind of unhurried, connected life I had been quietly hoping to find when I signed that assignment paperwork back home. The warning came on my 3rd day, actually, though I didn't take it seriously at the time. I was buying rice from Mang Ramil, chatting about nothing in particular, when he handed me my change and said, almost as an afterthought, "Just make sure you're inside before 10." I laughed a little and asked if there was some kind of curfew I hadn't heard about, some local ordinance for foreigners maybe. He didn't laugh back. He just repeated it, a little more slowly this time. Not exactly a curfew, just don't open the door after 10. I asked why, mostly out of politeness more than genuine curiosity at that point, and he changed the subject smoothly, asking whether I liked the rice here better than what I was used to back home. I let it go entirely. New places have new customs, I told myself on the walk back. Maybe it was about safety in a town without much street lighting. Maybe it was about respect for a quiet neighborhood that valued its evening peace. Maybe it was something practical about insects or weather I simply hadn't thought of yet, coming from somewhere so different. But then it kept coming up, again and again, in ways that started to feel less like coincidence. Not in a way that felt urgent or alarming, more in the way people mention something they've simply always known, the way you might tell someone not to walk under a ladder without really believing in bad luck yourself, just because it's what you were taught. Aling Fei mentioned it while handing me a bundle of greens one morning, patting my hand gently as she said it. "Just remember, dear, whatever you hear, don't open that door once it's past 10. A teenager who sometimes helped translate for me at the market, a boy named Miguel, said it too, almost laughing as he said it, like it embarrassed him even to bring something so old-fashioned up to someone from outside. My landlord, when I signed the lease, had actually written a small note at the bottom of the agreement, almost like a formality tucked between the utility clauses. Tenant agrees not to open the front door after 10 p.m. for any reason. I remember reading that line at the time and assuming it was some kind of insurance clause, something about liability. I signed without asking a single question about it, eager to get the keys and move in. By the end of my second week, I'd heard some version of the same warning from at least 6 different people, and not one of them had given me a straight, complete answer about why. When I asked directly, I got vague half-explanations that never quite connected into anything solid. "It's just how it is here. It's tradition. It's for your own good, dear. Don't worry about the reason." Some people laughed it off entirely, waving a hand like I was overthinking a silly local superstition not worth a foreigner's attention. Others got noticeably quiet and changed the subject fast enough that I understood, without being told, not to push any further. That inconsistency was almost more unsettling to me than a single clear answer would have been. If it was truly dangerous, wouldn't everyone react to the question the same way? And if it was nothing at all, just an old superstition nobody actually believed anymore, why did even the people who laughed it off still make absolutely sure to be inside, doors locked, before 10 themselves, every single night without fail? I started paying much closer attention to how the town behaved once the sun began to go down, almost like I was conducting my own quiet investigation, without fully admitting that to myself. During the day it was ordinary and lively, full of motorbikes weaving around each other, market vendors calling out prices, children playing barefoot in the road while their mothers watched from nearby doorways. But as the evening wore on, something in the rhythm of the place shifted, subtly at first and then unmistakably. Shops closed earlier than I expected for a town that size, most of them shuttered by 8:30, even though there were still customers who might have wandered by later. Lights went off house by house, not all at once in some coordinated way, but steadily, like the whole street was quietly agreeing, without ever discussing it out loud, to wind itself down together. By 9:30, the road outside my window was almost completely empty, and by 9:45 it felt like the entire neighborhood was holding its breath. I never saw anyone rushing or panicking. There was no fear in it, no visible urgency. It was simply routine, the way people everywhere build routines around the things that matter most to them. Except this particular routine had a very specific, very consistent boundary attached to it that nobody seemed willing to fully explain. 10 o'clock. Doors closed. Stay inside, no matter what you hear. I decided I needed a straighter answer than don't ask questions. So one slow afternoon, when the shop was empty and Mang Ramil seemed in a talkative mood, I asked him directly, no small talk first this time, just, why can't I open my door after 10? He looked at me for a long moment, the kind of pause that told me he was genuinely deciding how much to say, weighing something in his head before answering. Finally, he told me there had been stories, a long time ago, generations back if you believe the oldest people in town, of people who did open their doors late at night, thinking it was a neighbor or a relative in some kind of trouble, calling out for help in a familiar voice. He said sometimes those weren't neighbors at all. I asked what exactly he meant by that, feeling a small chill despite the afternoon heat, and he just said, quietly, some things wear voices that aren't their own. Then he smiled, almost apologetically, like he regretted saying it that plainly, and added, maybe it's just an old story we still follow out of habit. Nothing more than that. But I noticed something important in that same conversation. He didn't open his own shop past 9. Not once in all the weeks I'd been coming there. Habit or not, he lived by the same rule he was half dismissing. That night was the first time I actually tested the rule myself, though not entirely on purpose. I'd left a pot on the stove and stepped outside around 9:45 to check on a plant I'd forgotten to water earlier that day, telling myself I still had plenty of time before the supposed cutoff. The street was already empty in a way that felt almost staged, like a photograph rather than a real place. Every house around me had its curtains drawn, lights dimmed low behind them, the kind of low orange glow that suggested people were still awake but deliberately keeping things quiet. I remember standing there in the dark for maybe 30 seconds, feeling something I couldn't quite name at the time. Not fear exactly, not in any sharp or immediate sense. More like the sensation of being the only person awake in a room full of people pretending to sleep, watching you without watching you. I went back inside quickly, locked the door, checked it twice, and didn't think much more about that particular feeling until 11 days later, when the knocking started. 3 slow knocks, then silence. I sat completely still on my bed, telling myself it was probably a neighbor, maybe someone locked out of their own house, maybe nothing at all worth this much attention. Then I heard my name, not shouted, just said clearly, calmly, in a voice that sounded almost exactly like Miguel, the teenager who sometimes translated for me at the market. "Ma'am, can you help? I think something happened to my brother." Every instinct I'd built over an entire lifetime told me to open that door immediately, without hesitation. Someone was hurt. Someone needed help, and I was the closest person who might be able to give it. My hand was actually on the lock before I stopped myself, remembering every single version of that same warning I'd been given for weeks, from 6 different people, in 6 slightly different ways, that all somehow pointed to the exact same conclusion. I stood there frozen, hand resting on the latch, heart pounding hard enough that I could feel it in my throat, and I did not open it. Instead, I called out through the door, "Are you okay? What happened? Tell me and I'll figure out how to help you from here." And the voice paused just slightly too long before answering. "Just open the door, please. I'll explain everything once you do." Something about that pause made the hair on my arms stand up completely. It wasn't wrong exactly, not in any way I could point to directly. It was just slightly off. the way a photocopy of something can look almost perfect at a glance and still feel wrong in a way you can't quite name or prove. I didn't open the door. I stepped back from it entirely, moving as quietly as I could, and sat down on the floor with my back pressed against the far wall, as if putting more distance between myself and that door would somehow help. After what felt like several long minutes but was probably closer to 60 seconds, the voice said quietly, almost pleasantly, "Never mind," and I heard footsteps moving away down the gravel path outside, unhurried, almost casual, like whoever or whatever it was had simply decided to try somewhere else instead. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat on that same spot on the floor for what felt like hours, listening to every small sound the house made, every settle of the roof, every distant dog bark, convinced each one was footsteps returning. In the morning, the very first thing I did, before even making coffee, was walk to the market to find the actual Miguel, the boy whose voice I thought I'd heard the night before. He was there, completely unbothered, helping his mother arrange vegetables into neat little pyramids, nowhere near my house the previous night by his own account and by his mother's confirmation. When I told him what happened, describing the voice as carefully as I could, he didn't look surprised at all. If anything, he looked almost relieved that I hadn't opened the door, his shoulders visibly relaxing as I finished the story. He said quietly, "Now you understand why we say it. Like this was simply the way every newcomer eventually came to understand the rule, through exactly this kind of experience." Over the following days, I finally got people to talk more openly about it. Maybe because I'd earned it by not opening the door when it counted. Maybe because once you've heard it yourself, people stop worrying about scaring you unnecessarily since the fear is already there regardless of what they say. What they described wasn't really about crime in the way I'd originally assumed when I first arrived, not thieves or attackers in any literal, provable sense that anyone could point to with evidence. It was older than that, tied to stories about the road my house sat on specifically. Stories about voices that borrow the shape and sound of people you trust completely, specifically in order to get you to open a door you'd otherwise keep locked without a second thought. Aling Fei told me about her own grandmother's account of it, a story passed down at family gatherings for as long as she could remember. An elderly man who ran a small shop near the church told me a similar version with slightly different details. The way folklore always shifts a little depending on who's carrying it forward through the years. Whether you believe in that explanation literally or not, and plenty of the younger people I spoke with, including Miguel himself, admitted they weren't entirely sure they believed it in any supernatural sense. The practical result across the entire town was exactly the same. Nobody in that town, believer or skeptic, young or old, opened their door after 10. It had stopped being a genuine question of belief a long time ago and become something closer to a shared agreement, a piece of inherited care passed down because enough people, over enough generations, had decided collectively that it was worth keeping, regardless of whether every individual fully bought into the original reasoning behind it. That reframed the entire warning for me, completely and almost immediately. I had assumed, without really examining the assumption at all, that this was fear, plain and simple, an entire community living slightly afraid of the dark for reasons rooted in old superstition. But standing in my kitchen a few days after the knocking, turning the story over and over again in my mind while I made coffee I barely drank, I realized it wasn't fear driving that habit at all, or at least not fear in the way I'd first understood it. It was something closer to care. A rule agreed upon by people who wanted to protect each other, refined and simplified over generations into something so straightforward that even a complete newcomer like me could follow it without needing to fully understand or believe every layer of the reasoning behind it. I didn't need to believe in whatever had knocked on my door that night, not in any literal sense. I just needed to trust the people who had been quietly keeping each other safe from it, in whatever form it actually took, for far longer than I had been alive, and long before I ever thought to ask why. I called my sister a few nights later and tried to explain what happened, stumbling through the story because I still hadn't fully processed it myself. She went quiet for a long moment on the other end of the line, the way people do when they're deciding whether to sound worried or supportive, weighing which reaction I actually needed to hear. Finally, she asked if I was scared to keep living there, if I wanted to come home early, if this changed anything about my plans. I told her the truth, which surprised even me a little as I said it out loud for the first time. I said I actually felt safer now than I had during my first 2 weeks, back when I didn't understand the rule at all and was simply following it blindly without knowing why it existed. Ignorance hadn't been protecting me during those early days. The rule had been protecting me the entire time, quietly, in the background, and I'd simply been too new and too unaware to recognize it. The town didn't visibly change after that night, not in any dramatic way you could point to. The market still opened before sunrise every single day. Mang Ramil still had my order ready before I asked for it, greeting me the same way he always had. Aling Fei still left vegetables on my step without a word, as though nothing at all had happened. But I noticed the small rituals differently now, with a kind of attention I hadn't had before. The way people said their goodnights a little earlier than felt strictly necessary to me at first, back when I thought it was simply an early-to-bed kind of town. The way lights went off house by house like a wave moving steadily down the street, each one following the one before it in an unspoken sequence. None of it seemed strange to me anymore. None of it felt like superstition dressed up as routine. It seemed instead like care, practiced for so long by so many people that it no longer needed to explain itself to anyone, least of all to a newcomer who hadn't yet earned the full story. In the weeks that followed, I found myself settling into that same rhythm without any resistance at all. The way you settle into a language once you stop translating every word in your head and simply start understanding it directly. I started locking my door earlier, sometimes by 9:30, just to feel that sense of settled safety a little sooner in the evening, rather than watching the clock tick toward 10 with any lingering anxiety. I noticed I slept better once I stopped fighting the rule and simply accepted it as part of how life worked here, the same way I'd eventually accepted the early market hours or the particular way people greeted each other on the street. Miguel and I talked about it again one afternoon, weeks later, sitting outside his mother's stall while she sorted through a delivery of fruit. He told me his own grandfather still tells the story every year around a particular local festival, embellishing it slightly differently each time depending on his mood, and that half the younger kids in town treat it like a ghost story, while the other half treat it like plain common sense, no different from locking your car or checking that the stove is off. Either way, he said, shrugging, nobody actually tests it. Why would you, when everyone around you has already decided it's worth respecting? I asked him once, half joking, whether he thought I'd imagined the whole thing that night, whether it might have simply been someone playing a prank on the new foreigner in town, testing how gullible I might be. He considered that seriously for a moment before answering, which I appreciated more than an immediate dismissal would have. He said it was possible, he supposed, that pranks happen sometimes, kids testing boundaries the way kids everywhere do. But he pointed out that whoever or whatever it was outside my door that night knew his name, knew the exact detail of a brother he does have, and knew precisely how to phrase the request in a way designed to bypass hesitation entirely. That level of specific knowledge, he said, quietly, wasn't the kind of thing pranksters usually bothered arranging in a town this small, where everyone already knew everyone else's business without needing to fake anything. I still don't know, with total certainty, what was actually outside my door that night. I've turned the question over more times than I can count, especially on quiet evenings when the street outside goes still the way it always does. But I've come to believe that the not knowing is almost beside the point. What mattered wasn't solving the mystery. What mattered was that an entire community across generations had agreed on a simple, unglamorous rule designed purely to protect its newest and most vulnerable members, people exactly like me, who wouldn't otherwise have any way of knowing what they didn't know. That kind of collective care doesn't require a fully proven explanation to be worth respecting. It only requires enough people, over enough time, deciding together that some things are worth protecting each other from, whether or not you can prove precisely what those things are. I still lock my door before 10 every single night, even now, even after everything's been explained to me as well as it possibly can be, by people who've lived here their entire lives. Some nights I hear something outside, usually just a dog wandering past, or wind moving through the trees near my window, and for half a second, my whole body still tenses the way it did that very first time, my hand instinctively checking that the lock is secure, even though I already know it is. But I don't feel afraid of the town anymore, not the way I might have expected to after an experience like that. If anything, I feel like I understand it now, in a way I never could have from the outside looking in, back during those first 2 easy, unquestioning weeks. It taught me that some warnings don't need a complete, fully rational explanation to deserve your respect and your obedience. Sometimes the people around you are simply passing along something they learned the hard way themselves, something meant to keep you safe long enough that you eventually come to understand it fully in your own time, through your own experience, exactly the way I did. If someone gives you a rule that sounds strange, in a place that isn't yours yet, before you decide it's nothing more than superstition or exaggeration dressed up in old language, it might be worth asking yourself a different question entirely. Not is this true, in some provable scientific sense, but why would an entire community agree to keep following this, generation after generation, at real cost and real inconvenience to themselves, if it didn't actually matter to them in some meaningful way? Sometimes the answer isn't really about what's knocking on the other side of the door at all. Sometimes it's about who's already inside, quietly looking out for you, long before you ever knew you needed it, and long before you had any way of understanding why. I think about that first night often, sitting with my back pressed against the wall, hand pulled away from the latch just in time, heart still pounding as I replay it. I didn't understand the town yet, not really, not in any deep way. I didn't understand the rule, or the history behind it, or the reasoning that generations of people had built into something as simple as a single sentence passed between neighbors. But I understood enough to listen, enough to trust people who clearly weren't trying to control me, but were genuinely trying to protect me. And that turned out to be the only thing that actually mattered in the moment it counted most. These days, when 10 o'clock comes and I hear the street outside go quiet, house by house, in that same steady wave I noticed all those months ago, I don't feel unsettled by it anymore, the way I once did. I feel something closer to gratitude, real and specific. Because somewhere between arriving as a stranger who signed a lease without asking a single question, and staying long enough to understand exactly why that one line mattered more than any other clause in the agreement, That rule stopped being someone else's warning, handed down for reasons I didn't need to fully grasp. It became mine too, in the fullest sense, something I now carry forward, the same way everyone here once carried it forward for me, long before I understood I needed it.